Hi guys, it's Geekonomics here, just filling the next gap in the OCR A-level specification with regard to my playlists. And as it happens, this would actually be appropriate for GCSE economists as well. So today we're looking at this whole notion of specialisation and the division of labour. And those of you who are doing the OCR A-level specification, you will note that there are three specific elements of the spec which refer specifically to specialisation and DOL, and they are as follows. Number one, explain what is meant by specialisation and the division of labour. Number two, evaluate, so that's our directive word for an essay, a discussion question, evaluate the role of specialisation and division of labour in addressing the problem of scarcity, which I touched upon on my video yesterday. And then thirdly, explain how specialisation encourages trade and exchange in an economy. So those are the three bullet points from the spec, and let's just go through each of those and talk a little bit about this notion of specialisation and trade. For any economists, be you GCSE or A-level, the first occasion that you will encounter specialisation and trade probably is with reference to Adam Smith and the pin factory. It's a very well referenced excerpt in most textbooks, and just talks about how it was first discovered that actually if you split large processes down into much more simple but very repetitive tasks, then your workers become much more productive, you then become much more efficient, your costs fall, and that enables you as a firm, a nation, to discover and develop a comparative advantage in a particular area. So I reference that term for you, comparative advantage. I often teach this alongside comparative advantage. And of course, a country is said to have a comparative advantage in the production of that good or service in which it has the lowest opportunity cost. Now, if you're not too familiar with comparative advantage, I'll put a little card up here somewhere and you can flick to my video on comparative advantage. So, Adam Smith and the pin factory, that's where it all started. Then, of course, in the 20th century, when it came to sort of mass car production, we saw the whole onset of automation and division of labour more and more, where machinery was combined with human labour, which was given very specific tasks, and that enabled output to be very fast, also quite high in quality, consistently, and enabled firms and countries to increase their output. When I was a student, I worked actually in a factory. I worked on the factory floor of a kettle factory. And I did that every summer whilst I was at university, and that gave me a real flavour of what it's like to work on the production line and to do the same task day in, day out. Now, I did become very quick at the job I was given. My job in the kettle factory was to simply polish the kettles and to put them in boxes. As you can imagine, I became very rapidly the fastest polisher in town, and the job that I did, whilst it was very repetitive, I was very quick at it, and in order to spice up my life from day to day, sometimes the manager would involve me in something I mentioned later on here, if I can find it, job rotation. And I was flicked from looking at kettles to toasters to brighten my day. If you haven't had the opportunity to visit a factory, a production line, I took my students to the Nissan factory here in the northeast in Sunderland, employing 7,000 people, 20,000 in the wider production chain. Great opportunity to see around it and to just see what that means for people and how that is set out. So the lines, the individuals doing their specific tasks, the fact that the tasks have to be done in a certain amount of time, very limited amount of time, and it's just continuous, no breaks really, and if you hold the line up, it costs the firm thousands. For every minute that the Nissan line stops, I think it costs them something in the region of £3,000. So not only is it very repetitive, but it can also be highly pressurised should you make a bit of a mess up and then interrupt the flow of the line. But well worth a visit if you do get the opportunity. So what do we mean here? We're talking about evaluate the role of specialisation and division labour in addressing the problem of scarcity. Now you'll note that in my previous video we were talking about, well, what do we mean by scarcity? So we mean that resources are scarce. The land, the labour, the capital and the enterprise. So how does specialisation overcome this, or how does it help to address this problem of scarcity? Well, first of all, you're giving individuals pretty simple tasks to do on a daily basis which they become very proficient at. And so it's not necessarily the case that you need very skilled labour in order to do the task. It's not as if you're asking somebody to do brain surgery. And so because of that, you can get the maximum out of your resources. It's also the case, of course, that you're using scarce resources, be that aluminum or steel or whatever it is that you're using to make your specific good. And as a consequence of specialising, you can get the very maximum output from the minimum number of inputs. Now, of course, that will have implications for costs. And those of you who are well ahead of the game and smarter than the average bear, you will know about costs and cost curves and ATC curves, AVC curves, AFC curves and all that jazz. So if you wanted to sort of link this into competition and market structures and all that type of thing, you could talk about the fact that these costs would be dropping, and as a consequence the implications would be that your cost curves would be moving down. That then enables you to have a wider margin between costs and prices and increased revenues and profit, etc, etc. But we digress there. Let's not get into that too much in this video. So you can get the maximum output from a minimum number of inputs. So there are certain efficiency links that you could make here. So you'll know, I'm sure, about allocative efficiency, productive efficiency, X-efficiency. Well, allocative, are you producing what the consumer wants? Well, no doubt you will be if you want to run a successful business. Are you productively efficient, i.e., are you getting the maximum output from the minimum inputs? Probably you will be. And are you X-efficient or X-inefficient? So X-efficiency is referred to as organisational slack, predominantly more commonly associated with public sector than private sector. So the likes of Nissan, you're unlikely to encounter that as much, especially at Nissan, because they have this system called Kaizen, which is continuous improvement, constantly seeking, constantly encouraging actually their employees to come up with new ideas for improving the flow in the factory floor, which ultimately will be to the benefit of costs for the firm. So we know that it increases productivity because people are doing small, relatively straightforward, but very repetitive tasks. And I think we shouldn't be remiss about the repetitive nature of these tasks. Doing the same thing day in, day out. If you think about your working lives, you're going to go into the world of work maybe at 18, pick up your state pension at 67, probably later by the time you get there. So you're going to have many years, potentially, where you could be working on a production line. Now, with the best will in the world, boredom will set in. That will impinge on quality. And so these companies, these organisations, they do, when we're at the Nissan factory, they have what they know as stations. And so at some stations, the employees are responsible for, let's say, putting the wheels on. For some stations, they're responsible for putting the dashboard in. Others are responsible for water testing and making sure that it's all sealed correctly. And the workers rotate around a number of these stations through the week. And that, of course, is to hopefully alleviate this problem of potential boredom so that people don't become a bit blasé, a bit complacent, and the quality of their work might start to fall. Now, we were at an economics conference at the beginning of this academic year at Loreto School in Edinburgh, and the speaker there, whose name escapes me at the moment, from the Institute of Economic Affairs, he gave a little careers talk, and it was outstanding. One of the things that he recommended to students, to my students and to everybody there, was that you should try and get yourselves a talent stack. So don't specialise in one thing, but be quite good at a broad range of things. And you can see, I'm sure, that if you work in a factory floor such as this, then your talent stack is going to be relatively limited and also very specific to the industry concerned. So if you're working in a car production plant, then obviously you're very much specialised in car production techniques. Maybe you will not therefore have transferable skills. Now, from an economy's point of view, that obviously creates some labour market inflexibilities, and we could talk about those labour market failures, and we will do, I'm sure, in later videos, because that, of course, would be a great thing to discuss with regard to the inflexibility of specific labour markets. But just remember that, and remember this whole notion of the Dutch disease, that putting all your eggs in one basket. Should things not go well in the car industry, and let's face it, we're seeing the ramifications of Brexit at the moment, and in our local factory here in Nissan, they're not going to launch the production of the new Nissan SUV there. They're deciding to move that out. Just on the BBC this morning, there was talk about Toyota and another. We've already had news from Honda. So, should you go into work one day, well, there was, feel very sorry for those people. They arrive into their workplace, they didn't know anything about what was going to happen at the Honda factory, and then they're told, well, in a couple of years we're going to be shutting up shop. Well, those people have a very specific talent stack, all their eggs in one basket, and you just wonder, don't you, and you worry and you think about, well, what are these people going to do 2, 3, 4 years down the line? So that is a bit of a disadvantage, isn't it? I've drawn just a very basic demand and supply diagram here, where we can illustrate productivity gains, supply curve shifting right, price dropping, increased quantity demanded and supplied. And of course, that marries in very well when we're talking about productivity and gaining comparative advantage. If you can produce something at relatively low opportunity cost relative to competitors, then that would of course encourage trade not only within a country, from maybe north to south, east to west, all around the country, but also between nations. And of course that is this whole notion of the law of comparative advantage. Specialise in what you're best at, then engage in trade. But as we've been considering, and my A-level students have been considering late in recent lessons, well, when you start introducing tariffs, for example, on trade, which of course are trying to be negotiated with the Brexit deal at the moment, or you start removing them, then that obviously distorts trade because it is distorting the relative efficiencies. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that, ladies and gentlemen, and see you next time. Bye for now.